Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I'm your host. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm happy to announce this is our 10th episode of Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. And this is going to be a little bit of a shout out now. Here in the office with me is somebody who's very special. She didn't know I was going to do this. Alana Zariello is here. Alana, none of this could happen without you. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the good work that you do in bringing Beyond the Gavel onto the airwaves. And I'm very happy to announce that you are starting law school in August. Congratulations at St. Mary's Law School, my alma mater. And for those of you that are interested, Alana was my very first guest back in episode 1. So for those of you that are interested, I have been a guest on a few podcasts in my professional career. There was one that dropped within the last few days at the Bell Post, and people tell me that I speak a little odd when it relates to how I say Bell. It's Bail Post, TheTheBailPost.com. We have a conversation about legal issues. I invite you to listen to it, provide feedback. I always enjoy being a guest. So thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing us to proceed with our 10th episode of Beyond the Gavel. None of this would happen without you, the listener. I got to tell you, I feel like we're doing really well with the podcast. So again, thank you. Today we have a very special person. We have Carmen Tarragona Saez, who is an interpreter in Bexar County. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Carmen. Carmen was born in Mexico City, but she's lived in the United States at different points in her life. She's been living in San Antonio since 2009. She has 3 grown children whom she adores. Carmen actually studied law in Mexico, although she tells me that she's never before practiced as an attorney. She also did the paralegal program at UTSA. Carmen is a staff interpreter in Bexar County since September of 2019. She tells me she really loves her job. And before we get started, Carmen, I understand you recently became a U.S. citizen. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh, how
It's one of the happiest days of my life.
Yeah, tell me about that. What was that like?
Oh, my goodness. I had waited for it for 12 years. It's like the realization of something you've hoped for and, wanted for so long that it is really, of course, you can imagine I cried, and it really made me think how fortunate we are and that sometimes American-born citizens sometimes take for granted.
Yes. When I was in college, I had an opportunity to study abroad. So I lived in London, traveled all over Europe, Western Europe, and actually spent a lot of time in Mexico, including Mexico City. And every time I come back, I'm always so grateful to be an American citizen. It always makes me proud to be from Texas.
I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could.
I think you're a Texan. I think you've proven yourself to be there. All right. So tell us a little bit about your job as an interpreter. How was it that you came to be an interpreter?
Well, that's a funny story behind that. I actually was going through my divorce here in Bexar County, and we brought an attorney as an expert witness, an attorney from Mexico who didn't speak any English. So the court interpreters had to come to the hearing, and my divorce attorney reached out to me and said, "You should do this." And I thought, yeah, I should, because I love the law and I think I speak English pretty well, I think. So I think that's something that's very interesting. So I got a career out of it, plus that divorce.
So you walked away from your divorce and you got something grand out of it.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, it's very important, I think, to know that you're from Mexico City. Do you have any memory of Mexico City? Do you have any?
Oh, yes. I went from kindergarten all the way through elementary school, Mexico City. And then I went to the middle school in Houston.
Uh-huh.
And then I returned in high school in Mexico. So I think I was raised and grew up there until, later in my life did I live in different cities in the U.S.
And then you studied law there, right?
Yes.
And so the legal system in Mexico is what we refer to as the civil law system, where everything is codified.
Yes.
It's not like the common law system in the United States.
That is when I went to law school, that's the way it was. But
Right.
I think they are trying, at least in criminal cases,
Yes.
to become more like the U.S. system.
It's starting to
The common law.
change.
It's starting to change.
Yes.
They have open, trials, and they have mimicked in a way the
Right.
U.S. system.
They have
So
juries now.
I think they do.
Yes. So just to kind of talk a little bit about what that means. So on the civil law system, that comes from Roman codes originally. The French used it. The Germans developed a really good civil law system. You see a lot of that type of legal system in Latin America, in Asia, certain parts of Europe. And the idea there is the legislatures really write all the laws, right? And so they produce these codes and they try their best to figure out every potential situation and circumstance. They codify it so the judges don't really have as much discretion as they do in the common law system. Is that right?
That's the way I understand it.
Okay. And so the common law system we get from Great Britain, and you see most of that like in the United States, you see it in Canada, Australia, certain governments that took their framework, their legal framework from Great Britain. I don't know how I could say that differently, but and so in the common law system, what we do is we have judicial made law. So judges produce all the case books, all the different rulings that appellate courts make. Those are in books. And as a result of that, we have law that moves very slowly, right? Because we have stare decisis, where we look at precedent. We have open trials to the public. We have jury trials where members of the community come in, listen to evidence. And so there's a lot of different processes that happen in the United States. You gave me a little bit of an idea of what your thoughts are about comparing the two systems. What is it about this system here that really stands out for you?
First of all, that it's open,
Yes.
that anybody can come and see how the DA behaves, how the defense attorney, that, the evidence that's presented, the judge, and also that not only one person holds the decision, that you have
Right.
12 people
Right.
who will decide your guilt or innocence instead of just one person.
Well, that's interesting. And we could have a whole conversation on that. Let's talk about being an interpreter. What is it exactly that a court interpreter does?
Everything. The court interpreter is the bridge between a person who doesn't speak the language and who is in difficult situation. If you're in court, unless you're adopting a child, it's probably not a happy situation.
Yes.
So it's an honor really to be able to help someone understand what is going on. It's so fragile if you don't understand it. A word could make a difference.
So what you're doing is you're helping individuals that come into the court system, you're helping them have a voice, or
Yes,
you're helping
to
them
be their
gain.
voice.
Yes. Explain to us how it is that one comes to be a court interpreter.
I'm glad you asked that, because many people think that being bilingual, it's like, I could interpret. Being bilingual does not make you an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
It's a start, but you have to study and study hard. And if I may add, that's why I'll be forever grateful to Julieta Schultz.
Yes.
Because she trained me and she taught me the theory and the practice, and she made me an interpreter. So you have to study and take a written exam. If you pass the test, the written exam, then you can take an oral exam. And it is not only the terminology, it is the speed, it is the accuracy. So there's a lot.
So when I was practicing as a defense attorney back, I don't know how long ago it's been now, but we would actually tell the judge, I can speak Spanish, and we would act as the interpreter for our client. Now that's not possible, right?
No.
So now you have to be certified.
Yes.
And so being certified means you take an exam, as you said, right?
Mhm.
How long is that course of study?
Well, it depends. It's really at your own pace.
Mhm.
Whenever you feel you are ready to take the exam. And also, what's interesting is if you get a minimum passing grade of 70,
Yes.
if you get above 70 but below 80, you can only interpret in county courts.
Okay.
So if you get 80 or above, you can interpret in district courts.
And just so folks know, when you say in a county court, that's generally speaking misdemeanors on the criminal court side. On the civil court side, it's a certain jurisdiction that is less than a district court. And a district court on the criminal side handles felony cases. I was in a jury trial once where there was a translator, and the translator said something. The defense attorney immediately objected to it and said, "I object. That is not what the speaker said." And so there's always, I'm sure you get a lot of those issues regarding people saying, well, that's not really what the person that was saying said, right? That's not really what the witness was saying. How accurate is the translation?
As accurate, you have to either stand corrected. If you've made a mistake, you have to own it and say, Your Honor, interpreter wants to correct the record.
Mm-hmm.
But you also can say interpreter stands by her or his interpretation because, again, maybe that attorney spoke Spanish, but he doesn't know the legal term. I see a lot of attorneys who speak Spanish who refer to the plea agreement with el negocio.
Right.
That is not the correct term. And I'm sure maybe the defendant understands him, but then when you stand next to him and you use the correct term, they look at like, what are you talking about? And also it's interesting because even speaking the same language, words can have a different meaning in different countries.
Right.
So maybe if the person testifying is from El Salvador and the attorney is used to, Mexican or Tex-Mex Spanish, he might have understood, but the way he's saying it, it's correct.
Right. And that's because it's not only the intonation that's different, right? It's not only the way accent marks are used and how phrases are used, but apart from the way Spanish is used in different places, you also got to get to the point of understanding Latin, right? Because the language of the law is Latin. I asked you before we started, while we're getting mic'd up, what your name meant. What does Carmen mean? And you told me it meant what?
Poem or song.
Right. And so Latin is a beautiful language and in so many different ways. And so let's say sometimes, and I've seen this happen where there's a court proceeding where a side is trying to enter some sort of statement, an oral statement. Have you ever been hired, or are you familiar with interpreters that get hired to listen to the oral document, translate it, present it in court as a true and correct interpretation or translation of what is being said on the video?
Yes, that is a forensic transcription and translation.
Can you tell us how that works?
Well, just so you get an idea, on average, every minute of video or audio takes like an hour to transcribe and translate.
Every minute?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Because again, there's so much at stake. You can't say, well, I think he or she said that. You have to listen to it. And there's background noise and there are overlapping voices. So it's very tedious, but important work.
So when you say that when you interpret, tone has to be similar, we know that when we communicate, especially when folks communicate in court, they use things like facial expressions, they use things like body language, they got voice inflections. Does the interpreter focus on speaking in the same manner, speaking in the same way to try to get across the same type of communication that is being done from the witness?
Well, you're not supposed, if they, flap their hands, you're not supposed to do it. But I think, like you said, intonation and inflection is important too. You are being their voice. So if someone is very animated saying something, you can't just go monotone. I don't think it has the same. That's me. I could be wrong.
Uh-huh.
But it's funny that you say that because you do have to, you cannot modify, add, omit, or say, oh, what they really meant was this. And actually, there's another funny story. One lady said, I had a shot of asteroids
Yes.
with, and hypothermic needle. So if that's what she says in Spanish, that's what you're going to translate. You cannot correct it. And so sometimes we realize that what you're interpreting doesn't make sense. But if that's what the person said, that's what you have to say.
Regardless. And so, I can imagine on the court side, when you hear testimony, the court reporter is transcribing. And I did have an episode with our court reporter, Mary Ross. And one of the things that I think about with her is I have the opportunity to read what she writes as people are testifying, and I can hear what they're saying. And at the same time, it's confusing to me because when you see what they write, it's cold, right? It's the record, it's just word. But when you interpret, you're doing more than just using words. And when you say that you're trying to be their voice, you're trying to represent them, right?
Yes.
What's that experience like?
It is so humbling.
Mm-hmm.
It is so humbling to help in that way.
How many times do you come into a courtroom and there's an attorney attempting to speak to their client and they ask for you, right? They ask for you to come down,
Yes.
Or you actually have to interpret for the attorney and the client?
Many times, because they try to explain the paperwork
Mm-hmm.
to them. So many times, that's the first step before they plead. You help the attorney communicate with his client.
One of the most important relationships in the courtroom is between the defense attorney and the client. And so then you as the interpreter are privy sometimes to what could be considered to be attorney-client privilege. Is there some sort of oath that you have to take or some sort of, you want to tell us what that means?
Of course, Your Honor, we have a code of ethics,
Uh-huh.
and one of them is exactly confidentiality.
Uh-huh.
You do not divulge in any way what you've been privy to, and you do not discuss it. You're there to facilitate communication, not to absorb information
Yes.
and I mean, you're there. So, and that's also part of the humbling. You're trusted to be there.
Right.
Sometimes people are at their worst or their most vulnerable,
Mhm.
and they trust you to be there.
So what happens, as an example, let's say you walk into a courtroom and you're asked to help an attorney interpret some documentation that they're signing, like let's say plea paperwork, and the attorney isn't really explaining the paperwork in the correct way. Have you ever come across that situation? Okay.
No, that has not happened, but it is interesting. I think people, when they speak the same language, automatically feel, so they go, so where can I, or what should I?
Mhm.
And that's where you have to say, I'm sorry, I cannot give any sort of advice. I can only interpret what you say or your attorney says. And they look to you like, we speak the same language. I can
Right.
trust you. Tell me what to do.
Right.
And that's where you have to be very clear and say, I cannot say anything except what you say and the other person says.
That probably happens quite a bit, right? And maybe they even ask you, do you think it's a good deal for me to take?
Oh, of course they do.
Right.
And that's where you have to say, no, I can't do that.
Yeah, that happens to me too. After I deal with juries, I always go to the back and thank the jury for their service once they've had a verdict. And the very first question invariably out of jurors' mouths is, do you agree with what we did? Do you think we made a good decision? And I always tell them, look, you are on the jury. You are the judges. You heard every bit of evidence. You took the duty seriously. Nobody has a right to question your decision. Nobody was in that courtroom with the legal instruction that you had, listening, paying attention, watching, feeling everything that came out to question anything that you did. If you say X, then that is the end result. You are here to tell us what the truth is. And I guess in your particular situation, you're there to interpret.
Exactly.
That's the idea.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yes. But also imagine what the interpreter says is what's going to be on the record.
Yes. So it's not what the witness or defendant or victim is saying. It's what you say.
Ideally, you
Yeah.
are saying exactly what the witness or defendant is saying.
Mhm.
But when you have attorneys or even jurors, I've heard juries being instructed, even though you speak Spanish,
Yes.
don't. You have to, whatever the interpreter says, that's. So imagine the responsibility.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I've had to shut myself off on as well, right? So in the beginning, when I first became a judge, I would listen to somebody speak in Spanish, and I'm listening to them speak in Spanish, not really paying attention to what the interpreter is saying. You have to learn in the court system, you have to turn yourself off. The interpreter is the only one that is speaking on behalf of the person who is speaking.
But I have to ask you,
Yes.
has it ever happened that you speaking Spanish as well as you do, you hear the interpreter saying something that's not correct? What do you do?
Initially, when I first entered the legal system, I had this idea that, okay, I'm not quite sure that that's what the person said that was interpreted. But then I had to learn that I don't understand all the different idioms, all the different types of languages within the Spanish language that exists. And so interpreters are trained, if somebody is from Cuba, if somebody's from Puerto Rico, if somebody is from some other South American or Latin American country, then they have to understand the dialect that is being spoken. And I don't understand those dialects. So I've come to rely on the interpreter and realize that my initial feeling of, hey, I understand Spanish well enough to where I don't think necessarily that's what that person said. I've learned to rely and trust on the interpreter because I don't understand all those different types of dialects and phrasings that they use in other places.
Many times I've wondered what happens if a judge clearly sees that something is wrong.
Obviously, the record doesn't have the other stuff that we've talked about. And so I do pay attention to that stuff as well. But it is very important for me to understand what the appellate courts are going to read to make sure that the record is complete, which is really the responsibility of a judge. I want to have a good record for the appellate courts. All right, Carmen, I'm enjoying talking to you. Let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at BeyondTheGavelPodcast.com.
Welcome to Q&A. We have a question from Jaime. And, folks have been asked about the Q&A that we do here. We do get a lot of questions. These are not prepared questions. They're not prepared answers. But we have had some requests to maybe consider doing an entire episode of Q&A. Because I really enjoy doing it, and I love to involve some of the folks that we're talking to as it relates to answering some of these questions. So, from Jaime, do you risk deportation for low-level criminal offenses? It's a great question. The first thing I would ask is, what does a low-level criminal offense mean? We can define that on so many different levels. You could have a Class B misdemeanor, which is the lowest arrestable case, charged with theft, an individual charged with theft. And theft is considered to be a crime of moral turpitude. But on the court side, we look at it as a low-level criminal offense. Let's say that you have a fight that's an assault in a schoolyard, and there's a couple of older high school individuals that are of age. Those individuals theoretically charged with an assault could be considered to be crimes of violence. And so there are issues relating to all levels of cases where somebody could be deported. In fact, what we have to do when we admonish defendants in front of us before every single plea, and this applies for every misdemeanor case and every felony case, is clients have to acknowledge that they have been advised of their deportation rights when they enter into those negotiations, because theoretically, if they don't understand the collateral consequences of their plea and they're later deported, they could come back on something that we call a writ of habeas corpus and state they didn't understand the nature of their plea. They didn't understand the collateral consequences of their plea. They would have had the understanding and the explanations provided to them, then they would not have entered into that agreement. And defense attorneys are responsible for making sure that every defendant that they take before the court understands those consequences, and judges are responsible to ensure that the defendant and that the attorney had those conversations and understand that deportation is always a risk of a plea. Thank you very much, Jaime. I enjoyed reading your question, and I enjoyed answering it.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at BeyondTheGavelPodcast.com.
Welcome back. I'm here talking to Carmen. So, as an interpreter, you interpret for all manner of hearings. You mentioned all the different kinds of courts, right? You're all over the county. Theoretically, if you wanted to, you could work private practice, right? You could be an independent freelancer, yes. And so, as it relates to jury trials, I notice in jury trials, on occasion, every X number of minutes, interpreters need to be switched out, right? Is there some sort of regulation or rule that an interpreter can only work for so long during a trial before they need to change?
It's not a regulation or rule, but the truth is that you can get mentally exhausted because, again, you're listening in one language while you're speaking in another. And if you're tired, you're not going to do your best. So it's customary, of course, if someone's available, to switch out every 2 hours.
Okay.
And I'm sure you know this, but it's interesting that in federal courts recently, it wasn't that way before. They work in teams of two, as do American Sign Language interpreters, because if you get tired, you're more likely to make a mistake. So it's not a rule per se, but it's customary to say, okay, I need to regroup and get my mind together again.
Because after a while, your brain becomes mush.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about where our society has gone as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Back in March of 2020, we started doing everything by Zoom because we canceled locally in-person hearings and in-person trials. And so how did that affect your art or your work?
Well, I think when Zoom first started and WebEx meetings and all this technology that we didn't need before, we were all going crazy. And it took 20 minutes to, what interpretation button? What are you talking about on both ends?
Took forever. Yeah.
It's like, no, click on this. But I always think, as difficult as it was in the beginning, what would we have done without it? Can you imagine if we had completely, closed for 2 years?
Oh, yeah.
I cannot imagine. And now it's funny because we're used to it and everybody knows how to use it. And even though it's not the middle of the COVID pandemic anymore, it's like, hey, why get rid of something that works?
In a lot of ways. Yeah, absolutely. Right. We have situations where, let's say we're in a courtroom, we need a Spanish-speaking interpreter on the spot. And so we need to call somebody, set up for them to appear virtually on the big screen behind me while everybody else is in the courtroom. In that situation, then, everybody has to wait for the individual to be speaking and then the individual to be translated for.
Yes.
That's a little more difficult.
Yes, and those hybrid hearings are crazy because it's like, do they want me in person? Do I go to the courtroom or log on?
Yeah. So on the criminal side, we really don't have those hybrid hearings much anymore, right?
Not anymore.
On occasion, there's a need.
Very rarely.
I notice there are some court interpreters that come in and interpret behind the person that they're interpreting for, and others use the headphones. You want to tell us a little bit what the difference is with that?
Well, speaking of time,
yes.
You don't want to take up a lot of time. And so for a plea, let's say, and I speak only for myself, there's no right or wrong. I think it's a personal choice.
Of course.
I don't like to take up the time of, hey, put on the headphones, let me see. Of course, if it's a 3-hour hearing, you're going to ask the party to put on the headphones and you use the mic. And also for me, again, just personally, I think it's colder to give them headphones and you stand. I think it gives them some sort of comfort that you're there.
That makes sense.
And I mean, sometimes, especially when they're inmates, they might feel like they are looked down upon and in a way, maybe they care, maybe they don't. I think it's nice to say, I'm fine to stand right next to you or right behind you. We're good.
It gives them a sense that they're part of the system, as opposed to being separated from the system and looked at or viewed at differently.
Yeah, more than separated from the system, being looked down upon. They're already accused of a crime. They are already, I think, at a disadvantage because if you're there, they don't speak the language.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they did, maybe sometimes their education impedes them from really understanding. It goes beyond the language.
Right. Have you ever come across a language where it is very difficult to find a licensed interpreter?
Oh, yes, Your Honor. There are languages that I didn't even know existed, but someone out there speaks them. And actually, I have a funny story about that because that's also something you think about. Since a lot of people speak Spanish here, you feel like, you're everyone's watching you and everyone's listening to you and they can correct you. But one time they called for, I would be lying if I told you what exotic language, but very rare. We finally got an interpreter on the phone and he is going like, I kid you not, 3 minutes, blah, 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 blah. And the interpreter goes, he says, thank you. And I was like, I don't speak that language, but I'm pretty sure that there was more to that than thank you. So, but again, just because the jury or the judge or the attorney speaks Spanish, I mean, this is based on the honor code. If you don't understand, you trust that the interpreter is doing a good job.
You take an oath.
We take an oath. And every morning when I go and I really feel, and I think I speak for my coworkers, we take it so seriously. And it's amazing.
Well, you're working in Bexar County. You're a Bexar County employee.
I love it.
And I got to tell you, I asked a few people in that office because you work under the Office of Court Administration with the criminal courts.
Yes.
Right? So you work with us.
Yes.
For whatever reason in Bexar County, the criminal courts work with the interpreters and provide them for whoever needs them within the county.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about what it's like to be an employee of Bexar County as an interpreter. How many interpreters do we employ in our county?
Well, there's 3 staff interpreters, but we always get, we've been so busy that we always get 1 or 2 freelance interpreters.
So a staff interpreter means that you're a county employee, right?
Correct.
Which means you get the benefits of working for government.
Yes.
8 to 5 or longer, depending. Typically holidays off, you get health insurance, you get all the benefits of being a county employee.
And may I say the biggest benefit? The people I work with and the people I work for.
Everybody. Just being involved with a big organization like Bexar County is a really neat thing. I agree.
It's the best. And you build relationships.
That is truly the special part of it.
Yes.
Everybody that we come across.
Yes.
Yes. And so I asked everybody in there, like, who would be a good person to bring on beyond the gavel and talk? And everybody said you.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And it's all because you have that understanding of the relationships and how important it is when you work with folks. So you talk about the joy that you have on your job.
Yes.
Which is a blessing.
Yes.
I have the same experience. I cannot tell you how often I come to work driving in, feeling really blessed to represent the county.
Yes.
And initially it felt a little bit like a weight, not in a negative way, but a weight in the sense of this is really significant. And now it's a little more natural. It's a little more, just a real appreciation for having this position. Recognize that it's not going to last forever, like anything in life. What are some of the things when you get home and you reflect on that make you feel really good about what you did that day?
It is so rewarding, again, to be that bridge and you see all of human nature in a courtroom. You see people at their worst, at their best. You see someone who's a good person who made a mistake. You see a really evil person. You see judges and attorneys and DAs who are all working, striving to to make life better, not only for that person, but for everyone. I think there might be a lot of preconceived notions. Oh, court automatically bad. And
Right.
I wish a lot more people knew the hard work, the dedication, and I think your podcast is helping in that sense.
Thank you.
You know, that they don't see the effort, the dedication, the devotion of so many people to make it better.
It takes a lot of people in the courtroom to run the system,
Exactly.
right? It takes a lot of different departments that come together to work in tandem. And it really is a wonderful process when you experience it in person, right?
Exactly.
You know, it's not, people do have a conception that there are some things that are sometimes hidden or things that happen behind the scenes that may not be aware of. And people generally have a tendency to look at life that way. If they don't understand something, then they'll attach some purpose behind it to help explain it. But the reality of the court system as such is you have a lot of people that are dedicated to their craft that really do take a lot out of what they do. And it takes a toll on people, right? I know that there's been some talk lately about the toll and underpaid folks sometimes that work in government that they take with them when they go home. And sometimes, frankly, it affects me. Sometimes I get home, not too often, but I get home and there's a case or two that really sticks in my heart a little bit and it makes me hurt for a while. Does that ever happen to you as an interpreter?
Yes. When children are involved.
Mm-hmm. That's always difficult.
Yes.
Yes.
As a mom, I think it's like, no, children, different ball of wax there.
Yeah, and it's something we never get used to, but not just children, but also just folks, generally speaking, who you know are good people, who are caught in some behavior that causes great harm to them in whatever capacity, as a victim, as a defendant, as witnesses, whatever the circumstances, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that visitors of the courtroom always tell me that they seem surprised about is the camaraderie that the different parts of the courtroom infrastructure, the way they communicate with each other, the way they could be at each other's throats one minute, and then the next minute they're talking about what they had to eat last night, sort of like the old Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny. I can't remember that cartoon where they would fight during the day and then at night they'd say, hey, we're done. Good night. Have a good evening. See you tomorrow. Right. It's kind of the same idea. What is it about the court system with your experience that has surprised you coming in, being as intimately involved as you are?
Maybe that too.
Uh-huh.
It's the camaraderie that, like you say, they could be between even attorneys in civil cases, and they could be, at each other's legal's throats, and then it's like, okay, golf tomorrow, yeah, sure. And it's like, so, and that's part of, being professional versus, you can create great relationships, but you're here to do a job. So,
and the experience that you have of being a citizen, becoming a naturalized citizen of the United States, that has to be meaningful as it relates to the concept of working in the court system too, right?
Oh, definitely.
How does that feel?
And I think honestly that the fact that I had this job really helped me to become a citizen. They probably said, hey, if she's good enough, she's been vetted by Bexar County, so she can't be that bad.
That's right. Everybody in Bexar County loves her. I agree with that.
No, but seriously, it's a great honor to be a county employee. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know I could make more money being a freelance, but it's not just about money.
Outside of the legal system, what is the best part about becoming a naturalized citizen?
That's a hard one, because I've always said that a great part of what makes America great, it's legal system.
Yes. And it's obviously what separates us from other places, because we are a system of laws. Everything that we do in our country is surrounded by the concept of law. It doesn't matter what business you're in, every food that you taste, every activity that you're involved in, there are always lawyers and the law attached to that. So there's this perception that maybe, your name is Carmen, right? You have a Latin name. Latin is the language of the court system. And so how easy is it to translate different dialects in Spanish for you knowing that you are a native Spanish speaker?
Well, like you were mentioning, if it has different idioms or I ask for clarification. I think we all do. If you're not absolutely certain of what that person is saying, you need to ask for clarification. So again, you don't want to interrupt, but you want to do your job right. So
What are some interesting idioms that you've come across?
I could not ask for a single fruit in Venezuela.
Uh-huh.
That's how different it is.
Uh-huh.
I have a colleague, she's Maria Fernanda. She's amazing. She's from Venezuela. And, again, in our famous breakfast, it's like, oh, you brought parchita. What? What is this? I mean, we don't understand. I couldn't order fruit in Venezuela. And she finds it hilarious what we call that. Or it's a word, cola, in Spanish, it is tail. And apparently I think it's Venezuela again, that's what they call getting it right. So imagine the confusion that could be created.
I was speaking to an attorney last week, and she was telling me that there was an immigration case where the person's statement in Spanish was "se me hizo fácil," right?
Mhm.
Which se me hizo fácil means that it seemed easy. It seemed easy to me, right? Which is a Mexican idiomatic expression. The way this person interpreted it was, I didn't think about it, or I really didn't think about the consequences. And so as a result of that particular translation, apparently the court found that it was not an acceptance of responsibility of whatever this person was accused of. So have you seen those kinds of circumstances?
Yes, Your Honor. And those are very difficult because this is a perfect example.
Mhm.
You have to interpret exactly what is being said, but you don't interpret words, you interpret meaning.
Right. I get that.
So it's if you say that was not a literal translation, no, it wasn't. But in Mexico, you wouldn't say, I didn't think about the consequence. The expression for that is "se me hizo fácil."
Right.
So that's why it's difficult, because you can do a literal translation that is not really, another colleague said they were asking a witness, so did you get up at night? Yes, because bebo varios vasos de agua.
Uh-huh.
And she interpreted, I drink several glasses of water. Objection, that is not, nobody says, she interpreted correctly. The fact that it's not a literal interpretation doesn't mean it's an incorrect one.
And
We interpret meanings.
that's probably where you get the most objections in. Right?
Exactly. I don't think that was wrong.
And where I grew up on the coast, because my family grew up in a smaller area, a more rural area, their way of speaking is very different than somebody that grew up in a city like San Antonio. And so there are oftentimes I've used words with my mom, or I had used words with my grandparents when they were alive, that other people would kind of laugh at and say, I've never heard of that word.
Exactly.
I mean, and so sometimes in rural areas, we use Spanish that may be considered harsh or coarse. Let's say if somebody uses a word that for them, it's just the natural way of speaking, but we translate it in a way that where it may be some sort of curse word, or it may be some sort of.
But you say what they said. If they want more context, if they want a nuance, that's the attorney's job.
Mm-hmm.
So I say what that person said. If they want to say, what did you mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's not my job, right?
Right.
So to not get in any trouble, if someone has a question about what he means, go ahead. I think that's the safest, most professional way to do it.
Well, Carmen, I enjoyed speaking to you.
I love speaking with you. Thank you for this opportunity.
And I want to thank you for coming in. I think you were in the courtroom today, right?
Yes.
Yes. And every time you come in the courtroom, I wish I could somehow or another translate the smile that you've had throughout our entire conversation into the podcast, because that's exactly how you walk into the courtroom. And I think when you carry that positive spirit with you, you always get good results. You always,
Thank you, Your Honor.
you agree with that? I mean,
Of course, you get what you give.
yeah, you get what you give. That's a great way to say that.
And I listened to your latest podcast, and I love that you said that if someone smiles at you genuinely, that makes your day, because I feel the same way.
Absolutely. It means a lot. It's that human touch, right?
Yes.
It's that connection.
Yes.
Makes-
And especially in an environment like this where there's so much grief and problems,
Negativity.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for working with Bexar County.
It's my pleasure.
We're blessed to have you.
I'm blessed to be here, really.
Well, you've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate all of the listeners that have communicated with us. See you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks where we are educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.